Megan? I don't know. Okay, everybody, if you could take your seats quite quickly, please. Thank you. Yeah, they will be there. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. If I could have your attention, please. Thank you very much. I hope you're all enjoying ORFC 2019. Our next session is The Future of Farming, Brexit and Beyond. We have Kerry McCarthy, MP for Bristol East and Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Agroecology. She's chairing the session, and we have the Right Honourable Michael Gove, Secretary of State for the Environment, taking part as well. We'd like to thank you both for being here today. Thank you also to all of you who sent me questions over Christmas, which I have forwarded to Kerry. We will be having questions in the session as well. Other than that, please join me in introducing today's speakers. Thank you.
And then we'll go to the chair.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I'm not going to say anything by way of introduction other than to welcome the Secretary of State to this conference. He was here last year, and some people said that was very brave of a Conservative Secretary of State to venture down the road to the Oxford Real Farming Conference, but we did really appreciate it. And I have to say, as somebody who's been very involved in these issues, not just as chair of the Agroecology Group, but also on the Agriculture Bill Committee and the two main select committees that deal with the sort of issues covered by DEFRA. The one thing about Michael is he's always very willing to listen to ideas. He's actually interested in ideas, very willing to engage. You don't get the sort of just robotic response when you raise issues with him. Somebody's laughing in the audience because they probably think I'm referring to somebody else, but I'm not. I'm just being nice about Michael. So he's going to say a few words by way of introduction, and then we'll move on to the question and answer session. Okay, over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Kerry. Thank you. Well, not at all, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here. I know that this is the biggest ever real conference, and it's a sign of what I've identified as a growing and welcome interest in how our food is produced, the impact that it has on human health and the impact that its method of production has on our planet, and also a determination on the part of more and more people to get involved in the debate about food production, the natural environment, and human flourishing in its broadest sense. And that debate can only benefit from having as wide and diverse a range of voices committed to playing a part in it. Now, I know that talking about diversity of opinion, when it comes to the subject of Britain's departure from the European Union, that there will be a diversity of opinion in this room as there is across the country about the wisdom or unwisdom of that decision. But that decision having been taken, I do believe that one of the areas where there is a potential for us all to reap genuine benefits is in rethinking how we do agriculture, how we produce our food, and how we think about the environment. And outside the Common Agricultural Policy, there's an opportunity for the UK to develop a genuinely progressive approach towards farming, food production, and the environment. And our agriculture bill, which is only a framework bill, it's a set of tools which in different hands might achieve different things, but our agriculture bill, I believe, creates the tools which enable us to have an approach towards food production, which I hope other countries in the future will envy and seek to emulate. We all know that one of the problems with the Common Agricultural Policy is that its method of support for farming, area-based payments, is doubly bad. It's bad because it rewards those who already have land and wealth, and therefore, in economic and socio-economic terms, it's unjust. But we also know that it has incentivized a method of intensification over the years that has meant that we've seen environmental degradation that we need not have had occur. It is the case, of course, that under Pillar 2 of CAP, there are payments for not just rural development, but environmental and countryside stewardship. And yes, it is the case that Pillar 1 payments have gone through a greening process, but we also know that the scale of environmental degradation that we've seen over the course of the last 40 years is scarcely touched by those greening payments, scarcely reversed by the countryside and environmental stewardship payments that we've seen in the past. So what we can do with this legislation is replace those area-based payments and those weak mechanisms with a system of public money for public goods. And that means that the support that we commit to farming and food production should go to those who, as well as producing healthy food in a sustainable way for every section of our population, goes towards those who replenish our stock of natural capital. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means for those people who, for example, practice minimum till cultivation, which in itself, of course, is a way of reducing inputs and potentially, as a result, increasing productivity, that they should also be rewarded for the fact that by using min-till cultivation, there is less runoff and soil compaction, and therefore they're actually contributing not just to creating carbon sequestration, but also to improving water quality. In the same way, mixed farming methods that ensure that instead of relying on chemical fertilizer, we use the fertilizer that nature and livestock produce. That increases the organic content of our soil. That is a public good. That too should be rewarded. And in the same way, if people think that it's important that on their farm or on their land holding, that they combine the cultivation of food with forestry, that should be rewarded too. At the moment, under the Common Agricultural Policy, things like coppices and individual trees are permanently ineligible features for support. But the shape and nature of our countryside should be a patchwork and a mixture of areas from which we produce food and other areas which also provide a rich habitat for wildlife. So that's the aim of our policy, to make sure that we target support in a more sensitive and thoughtful way, and also we ensure that those who are responsible for producing our food see their role not in a binary way, but see their role both as food producers, but also stewards of the wider environment. And before I sit down, I just want to say a broader word about food as well. Because, of course, food production matters, and of course, the impact of things like climate change mean that there are some parts of our globe which we currently rely on for food that will face, as a result of global warming, a reduction in their capacity to generate food for the world. And that means that all of us will have to think in the global north about how we produce food, not just for ourselves, but for others in the future. A critical thing I think that we need to think about is what we really mean when we talk about food security and what we should really concentrate on when we think about our food economy. And I think it's important that we recognize that food security rests on making sure that we have a resilient environment so that decades and generations hence, we can ensure that this country can continue to produce healthy food in abundance. And that is why questions like soil quality matter so much. It's why thinking about natural capital as a stock to be renewed and enhanced is such a useful analytical tool. Because food security isn't simply about making sure that you have an arbitrary percentage of domestic production that meets domestic demand. It's thinking in the longer term about what your landscape provides. And that takes me briefly on to the question of our food economy. One of the problems in our food economy at the moment is that primary producers don't receive a sufficient slice of the cake in comparison to others in the food chain. And we need to think hard about making sure that there is greater equity across the food chain and making sure that we do have genuine fairness for primary producers and others. And the final thing that I would say about our food economy is that while all of us want to ensure that people at every level of income get the food they deserve and they need and should enjoy, what is often termed cheap food, as I mentioned in a different context, that cheap food, beef, soya beans produced as a result of deforestation and intensification, that cheap food literally costs us the earth. And much of what has been badged as cheap food, in fact, has environmental costs and externalities that all of us bear. And if we have a richer, more informed conversation about what food security should really look like and what our food economy should really seek to deliver, then I think that we have an opportunity in this country to lead the world in the development of the most progressive food economy and the most progressive agricultural economy as well. Thank you all.
Thanks, Michael. So let's hope the radio mics are working. Can you all hear me okay? Is that working? Right, so as Tom said, we've had a lot of questions submitted in advance. I would like to rely more on questions from the audience, but I'm going to kick off with the first question, which reflects a lot of the people that got in touch. So Michael, you said, you're saying the right things in terms of agroecology, organics, agroforestry, and so on, but there's no mention of those themes in the bill. And as you say, the bill is a toolkit that in somebody else's hands could be used in a different way. So how are we going to have certainty that all your warm words about supporting the approach that most people in this room favour, how can we be sure that that is actually genuinely going to be supported? The organics, for example, there are other countries such as France where they have legislation, they have a very active approach to boosting the organic sector. We don't get that in the UK.
I think it's a very fair challenge. As you mentioned, and as I said, the bill is a set of tools, and it's designed explicitly just to be a framework. One of the ways in which we think that it's possible to get the bill on the statute book relatively rapidly is by making it clear that we're not attempting to, in this government, dictate what every future government must and should do by way of agricultural support. But what we are doing is creating a dynamic, we think, whereby these tools in our hands will be used through the system of public money for public goods to change the approach that people perceive when it comes to agricultural support. The agricultural support, I think, in the past has been seen, and here I'm caricaturing, as essentially a way of giving cash to farmers and saying, get on with it. And therefore it's been seen as an overhang from the 1940s and 1950s and the process essentially of intensification and the process of people worried about the long shadow of the Second World War, wanting to ensure that food supply was healthy and thinking that the best way was simply a large block of subsidy. As I say, I caricature it because that's been the way in which it's been seen in the past, but it's had a purchase on the public imagination. I think that in the future, we can secure support for food and farming if people recognise the explicit link between the support we provide and the benefits beyond simply food production that farmers and landowners and land managers generate. And we think that we should make that explicit through our environmental land management contracts. And the challenge for us is in the course of the next couple of years to get those ELM contracts right so that the wider public can see that their money is going precisely to improving the organic content of soil, or to making sure that water bills are lower because farmers are contributing, as I mentioned earlier, to reducing runoff and to keeping our water purer. And it's making that link explicit, which I think means that future governments will find it more difficult to nibble away at this support or these instruments. So ultimately, while these tools, as you say, could be used by a different government for different ends, if it's the case that we can show the benefits that the right type of farming provides, and we can do so in the course of the next few years, then we can build what I think is truly important, which is a sort of cross-party and UK-wide consensus that this money is well spent in supporting the environmental leadership that so many show.
But in terms of the agriculture bill, which for those who haven't been following its process, it's gone through Bill Committee in the Commons. It's due to come back for report stage. We were expecting it before Christmas, but I think with Brexit and the vote on the deal, we've got to wait for that. So maybe mid-January, I don't know.
Yes, it should be. The report stage of the agriculture bill should be towards the end of this month, hopefully before the end of this month.
Right, okay.
And then it will go to the House of Lords. There are a number of amendments that we're considering, which we'll consider at report stage, which deal with a variety of questions.
Well, I was going to say one of those amendments that I've tabled, and I think others have tabled similar things, is on agroecology and support for whole farm systems. I did that during Bill Committee, and again, the Farming Minister said very nice things about government support for that, but didn't want it on the bill. Why can't it be on the face of the bill so that we know the government is absolutely committed to an agroecological approach?
I think one of the things that one of the things that's striking is that the principle, not the, well, maybe I should say the loudest criticism of the bill, has been that it doesn't specify food production in the way that some would have wanted. And that's because it's in the nature of the bill that it creates tools for us to do the right thing with. There is a legitimate argument, and I don't want to exaggerate it, for saying that the bill could have listed all sorts of additional benefits. It could have listed the benefits of organic production. It could have listed the advantage of creating more flower-rich meadows as pollinator habitats. It could have listed the Farmland Bird Index as one of the most powerful indices of biodiversity. The question is, how much detail do you want to go into in legislation? And then, how much do you... Sorry? That's the critical thing.
Okay.
But that's the critical thing.
Okay.
But delivery, the thing is that this is the first agriculture bill that we've had for a generation. And as we all know, it's not simply legislation which results in the delivery of these outcomes. It's also cash, contracts, regulation, enforcement, and other commitments. And the question that I would ask anyone to consider is that when you look in totality at everything that we're doing, when you look at the 25-year environment plan, when you look at our new programme of reforming regulation and inspection, ask yourself this: are these the sorts of steps that you would want to see the government take if it was embracing a genuinely more sustainable view of agriculture? And if you listen to some of the loudest criticisms that we face, they come from those who in the past have been critics of moves towards greater sustainability, who are worried that their voices are being increasingly less heard. So the question always is, if you're worried that we're not going fast enough, look at the critics on the other side and ask yourself why they seem to be perhaps a little more discombobulated than they were.
Okay, if we can move to questions from the audience. Do we have a roving mic? Yeah. Who wants to go first? So I think, Patrick, did you want to come in? I think you're going to ask something that is on my list, so we'll tick that one off.
Patrick Holden, Sustainable Food Trust. I want to respond to your very positive remarks about your intentions to change the economic environment for farmers, very specifically in relation to the Environmental Land Management Scheme. Will you introduce within that scheme incentives for building soil carbon in the way that you described, and to ensure, in relation to your remarks about the polluter pays, that nitrogen users are taxed for the damage that they are doing to the environment in relation to the good scientific data which already exists to quantify the damage done?
Yes. Well, in short, yes, but I think that there are important things to unpack there. The first thing to say is that organic farming produces a variety of goods, but one of them, you're absolutely right, is increasing the organic and the carbon content of our soil. We have suffered in this country and in other advanced agricultural economies from soil erosion, soil depletion, in a way that imperils the sustainability of agriculture in the future. There are, as we all know, parts of England where there are, who knows, 40, 50, 60 harvests left unless we make those changes. More broadly, it's not just the health of our soil in terms of future food production, it's also in terms of the fight against global warming that we do need to take these steps. So you are absolutely right. On the second point about nitrogen, obviously, 100 or so years ago, the industrial production of fertilizers, the Haber-Bosch method, did lead to a significant increase in production. But we now are very clear-eyed about what the costs have been in terms of nitrous oxide and air pollution, in terms of nitrates in our river, in terms of the change of the ecology on land and in our rivers and marine environments as a result of nitrogen and eutrophication. And we do definitely need to take steps in order to reduce our reliance on chemical fertilizer in the future. Now, I'm going to say something that some people in this room might push back against. It's not just making sure that we reduce our reliance on chemical fertilizer, it's also exploring perhaps some of the scientific innovation that might allow new seed varieties and new plant varieties to flourish without chemical inputs. And that might mean embracing some technologies that some people in this room would initially be suspicious of. But I think the key question is, and I know Patrick believes in this passionately, follow the science. The science of global warming is inescapable and undeniable. The science of what chemical fertilizers are doing to our soil and our water and our air is inescapable and undeniable. So therefore, if we have scientific solutions that can help us escape from the problems that have been generated, we should do so. And Patrick, you're absolutely right. The polluter pays principle, which we're going to enshrine in law through our new Environmental Principles and Governance Bill, is absolutely critical. And you are also right as well that organic production, I mentioned earlier, produces benefits far beyond those which the original pioneers of the organic movement envisaged, and we should recognize that and reward those who lead in that way.
Okay, as I think Humphrey would say, venturing onto the territory of gene editing is very brave of you, Minister, in this environment. But that was something that came up with the questions that were submitted before. And I don't know if there's anyone in the audience that specifically wants to come in on that point about gene editing or gene drives at the moment, before we move to another. I saw your hand first, and then we'll move on to other questions. Is it specifically on that point? Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much for being so frank with us. I'm Stephen Jacobs, Organic Farmers and Growers. The unintended consequences, for instance, from CRISPR-Cas have already been seen, and there are people, possibly even in this room, that would help you understand that not only is the science suspect, if we ended up in this position of a degenerative farming economy, going along more routes of more corporately owned seed, for instance, would surely be detrimental.
Well, I think it's a fair point. I think that there are, I mentioned earlier when I was down the road, that there are ethical and economic questions that we do need to ask. And one of them is, you're right, intellectual property, cartelization, whether or not there are a limited group of agri-tech giants who end up controlling more and more of the origin of our food supply. That is a challenge, undoubtedly. But I also think that there's a distinction, everyone in this room knows, between GM and gene editing. I think that gene editing has the opportunity and the potential to help us significantly, but I think the most important thing to do is to be guided by the science, and I would welcome the opportunity to invite you and others who have scientific and other concerns to come into DEFRA so that we can have an informed roundtable and conversation about these issues.
Okay, if we can, trying to find a woman to ask a question. Any women with their hands up? Okay, so I saw you first, yeah. So, okay. Right.
Maddie Harlan, Permaculture magazine. Are you going to therefore fund research into areas of regenerative agriculture and permaculture that so far have been pretty much ignored in the UK? We've got a firm basis for agroecology and agroforestry, but we don't have proper research yet into the really leading edge regenerative carbon farming programs.
Again, no, I think you're right. When I was again down the road, one of the points that I made there is that if we're thinking about food security in the broadest sense, and it touches on the question about gene editing as well, what we need to have, I believe, is a diversity of landscapes, a diversity of farm businesses, a diversity of farm sizes, in order to ensure that we're not trapped in a system of moving towards a monoculture, moving towards mega farms, moving towards a particular approach. And therefore, if we're going to maintain and indeed enhance that diversity, then we need to fund research and to support research, exactly as you say. Now, the decisions that are made by the research councils who allocate this funding are quite rightly insulated from government intervention, because it's important, again, that it should be academics, not politicians, driving the research council's work. But there is money that DEFRA has that we can devote to specific research that we believe is right, and I think you have put your finger on a particularly important part of rebalancing the way in which we look at how government money is spent and how we support genuine innovation in the future.
Okay, questions next to you for the sake of mic being passed around.
Nick Palmer, Compassion in World Farming. We very much welcome the inclusion of animal welfare as one of the criteria for public money for public goods. And we also welcome your commitment to gold standard labelling. And I wonder whether you've considered linking the two, in the sense that if a farm receives public funding to, for instance, de-intensify and to offer higher welfare standards, shouldn't they also be able to benefit from that by means of production labelling, so that they can distinguish themselves and not be permanently dependent on public subsidy, but help the whole market move up?
In short, yes. I think that there are a number of ways in which we can consider labelling reform. There are some of them which have to do with public health and safety, better allergen labelling for tragic reasons which we're all familiar with. But I think you're also right that labelling which enables the discerning consumer to know more about how food is produced, and for those people who do the right thing to secure a premium for their product in the market, is absolutely the right way to go. Now, there are competing visions of what we should champion in labelling, but one of the things that we've been doing at DEFRA is inviting in a variety of people, including Patrick Holden and others, to advise us on what they think we should or might consider doing. So absolutely, we need to make sure that conversation is as broad as possible, because concern about the circumstances under which livestock are raised is, I think, a growing factor in the choices that consumers make, and so therefore we do want to reward people who are doing the right thing.
Okay, there's a woman there, so and then I'll come over to this side.
Hi, Tracy Worcester, Farms Not Factories. I'm just wondering how you're going to prevent a flood of cheap imports coming in, particularly from America, to help the farmers to actually increase their, well, better standards. For example, I work in the pig industry, or not the industry, but challenging that system. And we've got a lot of food coming into this country which is illegal to produce in this country. Okay, so it's bankrupting our farmers. How are you going to help our farmers survive?
Well, There are two steps, I think. The first step is to make sure that we don't erode any of the protections that we currently have. We've been clear as a government that we're not going to, in pursuit of any trade deal, dismantle the environmental or animal welfare protections that we have. There's a second step, though, as well, which is, after Brexit, are there any adjustments that we want to make at the border in order to ensure that we can maintain those high standards? And there are potentially a range of tools available to a future UK government, whether they're regulatory tools or tariffs, which can ensure that we can maintain and enhance the high standards that we have and support those who are pursuing high standards here as well. I wouldn't want to preempt where that debate might go, but I think you are right that we do need to make sure that when we think about future trade deals, and indeed about existing economic relationships, that we don't do things which undermine the capacity of our own producers to aim even higher.
But can I press you on that,
Yes.
Secretary of State? So I've tabled a new clause 1 to the Agriculture Bill for report stage that is saying there should be, it's a non-regression clause, so no lowering of standards in post-Brexit trade deals. The chair of the EFRA Select Committee, who's a Conservative MP, a former farmer, has tabled something very similar. And I know that down the road there is as much support for a measure like that as there is in this room, because farmers will be the first to be affected if we allow cheaper imports into the country. Again, what is the reluctance to spell it out on the face of the bill, so that as to strengthen your hand when you go into, we know that the other departments who are pushing for trade deals, farming is going to be at the, I think Minette Walter said this on the Today programme this morning, farming is always at the bottom of the heap when it comes to things being traded off. Well, how can you be sure that your corner will prevail when it comes to these discussions? Because again, you can make the promises, but you've got other people that, you know, including Wilbur Ross, the US Commerce Secretary, that don't want the same as you.
I think that's a very fair challenge. I'd say three things. The first thing is that if we think back to before Brexit, thanks to the whole debate about TTIP, what was interesting about that debate is that the principal source of reluctance to embrace TTIP, apart from concerns about the impact on the NHS, we'll put that to one side.
People know what TTIP is, everybody.
Sorry.
So it was a transatlantic trade agreement with the EU.
Yeah, so a few years ago, as I say, even before Brexit, there was talk of a transatlantic trade and investment partnership between Europe and the US. And there was some concern about that, because the concern was that that would involve not just the UK, but the EU accepting American food standards, and that meant, and this became a very vivid part of the debate, accepting chlorine-washed chicken, hormone-enhanced beef. And actually, one of the reasons why TTIP didn't proceed in the way that some were arguing for was because of consumer resistance to lowering those barriers. So I absolutely take your point that not everyone in Whitehall, in every government, necessarily puts food, farming and the environment first, but the public do. So one of the first things that I would say is that there's a strong level of public support for maintaining those protections. The second thing that I would say is with respect to legislation. As well as environmental and animal welfare protections, I also think there are some social and economic protections as well, which do need to be honoured through non-regression clauses or by other means. So in the withdrawal agreement that we've concluded with the European Union, we have non-aggression principles on things like labour protection and workers' rights there as well. And I think the right thing to do is, whether through the trade bill or another piece of legislation, to make sure that there are protections which go beyond simply the environmental and animal welfare. And it's a matter for our lively debate at the moment, how we safeguard that. The only other thing that I would say is that Brexit doesn't just mean the government taking back control, it more particularly means Parliament taking back control. And through the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, any new treaty, including a trade treaty, would have to go through the House of Commons, and that would mean, inevitably, that if you or I felt that that treaty unacceptably harmed UK interests, we could stop it.
I did actually put forward a similar clause in the trade bill and got knocked back on that as well, so I'm not quite sure where the home for it is, but we will continue pushing, and at report stage we'll have a vote on it. I'm trying to find another woman. Oh, we've got two here, so actually we've got three. So let's do a little all-female huddle there. So, wait for the mic for a moment and then reintroduce yourself. Yeah.
Hi, Sue Everett. What, if anything, is the government planning to do to prevent Chinese banks, i.e. the Chinese state, and offshore companies buying up land in Britain and then claiming grants and support payments for that land?
Okay. And I think that goes very much to the heart of what quite a few people who submitted questions in advance said about how can you ensure that subsidies as well don't contribute to land price rises. Obviously, access to farming, land price is a real issue. And yeah, so perhaps some of the other points that came up around that whole issue of land prices were, will the 5 hectare minimum requirement be abolished in terms of subsidies so that everyone gets supported? And there was also a question about county farms and how do we stop them being sold off. So it's all goes down to the same issue in terms of how we ensuring as wide as possible access to farming and how do we ensure the price of land doesn't stop people getting involved.
Well, I mean, you put your finger on one of the very important weaknesses in the current system, because area-based payments, as I touched on briefly earlier, drive up the price of land, drive up the price of agricultural land, and they create a barrier to entry for new entrants into farming. Now, one of the things that I would say is that we want to ensure that whoever owns or manages land, they get paid for what they deliver. The market, notwithstanding the challenges that I mentioned earlier, provides a reward for food production. There are some things which are not produced in the market, environmental and other goods, which do need support and which we will pay for using public money. Now, if it were the case that you had an individual or a corporation that bought land, didn't receive area-based subsidy, but did do the right thing environmentally or elsewhere, then that individual or that organisation should continue to receive public money for the goods that they are providing. So I think it's important that whether or not you are a farmer with only 3 hectares or one with 300 or 3,000, if you are doing the right thing and providing public benefits, you should be supported. Now, there are broader questions about the value of agricultural land, the tax system, and so on, which are big questions that do need to be addressed. But the basic aim of our change and support is to make agricultural land, rather than being an area which is principally something that some see as an investment for a variety of reasons, in financial terms, is an asset that should be used for the good of all. The second thing, county farms. We'll be saying more about how we think both county farms and other routes into agriculture can help people who don't have access to capital, but who want to be involved in the business of food production, to take that step. But we're saying more about that in the next couple of months.
Okay. So, so can I just, you indicated that the 5 hectare limit is going to be abolished then. When's that going to happen?
Well, we can't do it until we're, provided the Prime Minister's deal goes through, until the end of the transition period, because most of the CAP rules... Well, most of the CAP rules, there's an interplay. There's an interplay between the two, but we should be able to after 2020.
Okay, so just behind you, the lady just behind you, and then I'll go to you in the end. Right, we've got about 10 minutes left.
Lydia Smith from NIAB. I have a apparently quite simple question. You're talking about restoring natural capital, which I totally support, of course. But those farmers that have been already doing very good work for many decades tend to slip through the mesh of support and payments. And secondly, those farmers that are doing something perhaps a little unusual or cutting edge or wacky also quite often don't fit a system which rewards innovative, good quality work. So how do you propose to try and not let that happen in a future support or payment system?
Well, the process of designing environmental land management contracts is one whereby we want to work with farmers at every level, from major landowners to new entrants at the lowest level, to design contracts whereby we can reward people appropriately and properly. Now, you put your finger on something which I think is important, which is that, by definition, any government system of support for a variety of goods which are not valued in the market has to come up with a means of providing a justification, a defensible justification for why we provide that support. And it will be the case, it will always be the case, that there will be some people who are doing imaginative and worthwhile things that are not captured by any system, because no system, however sophisticated, that is going to be run by a government will capture all of that. But the aim is to make sure that we can develop through pilots and evolve over time a fair and defensible method of rewarding people for doing the right thing. And the process that we're undertaking now is attempting, and I know that there's an element of comparing apples and pears, but saying to what extent is creating or enhancing particular habitats for wildlife something that we should reward? To what extent is improving the carbon content of soil something that we should reward? To what extent is taking appropriate steps to improve water or to reduce the impact on air quality something that we should either require through regulation as a baseline or explicitly reward as we are thinking of rewarding animal welfare? And I suspect at the end of this process that we won't have a perfect system in which everyone can agree that we are valuing things entirely fairly, but I hope that people would agree that the process of moving towards such a system is going to be significantly better than the current system of support and subsidy that we have.
Okay, so I've got the young woman there, and then after that we'll do a flurry of about 3 questions and finish off, so yeah.
Hi, Zoe Davis from Wildlife and Countryside Link. You've talked a lot about financial support for replenishing natural capital, which I fully support, but can you give any assurance that the amount of money needed for farmers to genuinely restore the natural environment will be available in the long term?
Well, I do believe that the most important way of ensuring that we can maintain that money is not just relying on any individual minister or chancellor or secretary of state, no matter how important he or she may be, is building a public consensus. So, to take a case in point, and it's a parallel question, this country is committed to the 0.7% target on development aid. And the reason that it's committed is partly, of course, because of the leadership of some politicians, but more because of the consensus that was built up over time on the vital importance of making that commitment. And one of the reasons why, it's one of many reasons why I think we need to move away from the old method of support for agriculture, is that over time, not just in this country but worldwide, it will become increasingly difficult to justify support of that kind. And if we do want to support farmers, land managers, and everyone who's involved in food production and environmental enhancement, then we need to broaden the range of goods that they are supported in providing, because that brings in the maximum number of interested voices who want to continue that support being maintained or even improved. It's probably too pompous to call it a political strategy, but my political strategy is partly shaped by the fact that in the UK, we have more people per capita than in any other country in the world who are members of environmental, wildlife, or conservation groups. And that means that we have a potential political consensus behind ensuring that the money that we currently spend in this area is enhanced as well as being better directed. And I think the more that we broaden that conversation, and the more that organisations like your own hold our feet to the fire, the more certain that we can be, whoever is Prime Minister in 5, 10 or 15 years' time, that we continue to make sure that this investment is safeguarded.
Okay. I would say the 0.7% is enshrined in law.
Indeed.
And that was partly to protect the commitment against future governments that might have a different view, which I think is partly what today's discussion about. But can I just follow up on that with something else that came in from people in advance about pesticide use?
Oh, yes.
Because I think it's linked in a way. The UK has signed up to reducing pesticide use, but actually the use and the toxicity has increased. So I suppose my question would be, again, it comes back to, you're saying all the right thing about trying to tackle issues like this, but the trend seems to be in the opposite direction, despite everyone's membership of Wildlife and Countryside linked related organisations. So how do you reverse that? And what role does integrated pest management have?
Integrated pest management is going to be absolutely critical to dealing with the problem or the challenge. And one of the things about pesticide use is that we have to, and it comes back to an earlier question, what is the way in which we can support farmers who want to make the transition and who want to do the right thing but who are currently worried about their bottom line? And that involves making sure that we can provide them with routes to change and support to change, which means that the over-reliance on chemical and synthetic inputs, which some have had in the past, can be overcome. Now, one of the things that we do is we look at particular pieces of scientific evidence that suggest that if there are particular products that need to be banned or need to have their use restricted, that we will ban them or restrict their use. But we also need to, at the same time, make sure that we can provide people with a route through the development of research or the development of support to ensuring that even as certain inputs and certain tools are denied them, that they know that they can have an economically viable method of maintaining productivity. And maintaining productivity doesn't mean necessarily maximizing yield, because it can sometimes mean, as you know, reducing the cost of inputs and at the same time, as a result, increasing profitability and productivity without leading to the degradation, the wider environmental degradation that overuse of pesticides generates.
Okay, we are almost running out of time. I know the session was billed for an hour, but actually the Secretary of State has to get away. So I'm going to take 3 very quick questions all at once, which hopefully it will get a quick answer. So, gentleman there in the check shirt, lady in the back with the scarf, and, okay, the back there.
Dave Stanley, Pasture-Fed Livestock Association. You said we've seen a method of intensification of agriculture, which we need not necessarily have had. That intensification is solely down to the use or abuse of fossil fuels. COP24 and the paper that was associated with it identified that if we're going to save the planet, we need a 50% reduction in fossil fuels by 2030 and 0 by 2050. How is the government going to achieve such reductions, and where do you see the role and the huge potential of agroecology contributing to that process?
Okay, I would say if we can, there's obviously, Michael doesn't cover the broader climate change energy use portfolio, so if when you answer, you could answer in specific about the carbon footprint of agriculture, I think that would help. At the back. Oh no, sorry, it was the lady there with the scarf, sorry.
Thank you. Minister, I'm Lisa Schneider from Devon Wildlife Trust. So the rivers in North Devon continue to be polluted by landowners, and we have very strong indications that a great number of landowners are not complying with their legal obligations on water quality. And yet we have had Environment Agency officers reduced because of funding cuts. We seem to be going backwards. Can you agree that we not only need strong regulatory standards on water quality, but we also need the public funding to make sure that that regulation is enforced and that farmers get adequate training so that they know what their obligations are?
And that ticks off very nicely the 6th out of the 7 questions I've got in front of me about the environmental watchdog and whether it's actually going to have any teeth to enforce any of these powers. And last question there.
Yeah, good afternoon. Martin Lyons, UK Chair of the Nature Friendly Farming Network. We've seen from the States review that farm inspections and regulation that the CAP system has driven far more intensive farming, which is detrimental to our soil, water, air quality. There's a real risk that for some, that the most productive land will be worn out in 40 years. The public money for public goods system set out in the agricultural bill promises to raise standards for those who engage with the land management plan. However, how does the Minister ensure that those who choose not to engage with such system will keep their land in good heart, meeting minimum environmental, animal health and food standards to prevent their land from being worn out and losing our long-term food security?
Okay.
I'll take the first, sorry, the last 2 questions overlap, though not perfectly, as it were, and I'll take them together. There are two particular things that I would say. The first is that we won't abandon the regulatory baseline that we currently have when it comes to environmental protection. And we intend actually to build on the report that Dame Glenn and Stacey has published about how we improve farm regulation and inspection. At the moment, farmers are subject to a variety of everyone in this room knows, a variety of different inspection regimes. Some of them, for example, the county or local authority responsibility on animal welfare, are scarcely discharged at all, save in a very few honourable exceptions. Others, like everything from how people handle slurry to other sources of river pollution, are very, very patchily enforced. Having focused and effective enforcement of a kind that is transparent and also which gives people an opportunity to understand what the rules are and what their responsibility is, should ensure that no one falls below that baseline. And of course, for those who want to go higher, then public money for public goods can help them in that ambition. But you are also right that when it comes to ensuring that we have effective inspection, we need to recognise that there are roles that the RPA play, the Environment Agency play, and others, including local authorities, play, that because they're overlapping, we need to simplify, and that is a challenge for the next couple of years. On the broader point about climate change, it's profoundly important. You're absolutely right. The process of chemical fertilizers and the tractor together transformed agriculture in the 20th century. But both of them are carbon-intensive processes, which we know we can't sustain in the future, which is why we need to move away from the reliance on fertilizer use, and also the reliance on the traditional diesel-fueled means of tillage and cultivation that we've had in the past. Now, I think, without wanting to be Pollyannish about it, that technology can help us in both those regards. Precision technology can ensure that the applications that we make on the soil are limited. Drone and other technology can make sure that the actual footprint on the soil and the amount of carbon and nitrogen and water that we use is diminished. But I think that it's important that we, as we think about how that technology can work, that we learn some of the lessons from the past. And some of the lessons from the past that I think that we particularly need to learn, and I know that the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association have been in the van of this, is that improving productivity is not simply about increasing yield at the expense of everything else. Improving productivity is about making sure that farming and food production is sustainable, and that means minimizing inputs and costs, dealing with environmental externalities, and making sure that you can take a genuinely long-term view about the assets that you have.
Hey, well, thank... It's a bit cheeky of you to come in on the floor, just as I was about to wrap things up.
I think it is a fair point, and one of the other things that we touched on earlier with respect to climate change is that climate change, unless dramatic steps are taken, will mean that, as I mentioned earlier, some currently fertile areas of the globe will no longer be able to sustain the level of food production that they currently sustain. And that means that countries in temperate regions in the global north, ourselves, Canada, and others, will be expected to pick up the slack in terms of increased food production overall. There will be changes to the flow of global trade and the centres of production globally that we do need to think hard about. It's also the case that there will be some other scientific innovations, not necessarily welcomed by everyone here, like vertical farming, that will also contribute to making sure that we rely more on domestic production, should we wish to, and less on transport costs in the future. But those innovations raise a whole set of ethical and economic issues, which people in this room I know will want to vigorously debate, and I'll look forward to hearing from you all over the course of the next 12 months.
Right. Thank you so much, Secretary of State, for coming. We all show our appreciation.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you both for appearing today. And if everyone could stay seated and those standing could part slightly so the speakers could leave the stage quickly, that would be most appreciated. Thank you. Thank you.